Your party makes their way across a ramshackle bridge, down some stairs, and before a large brass door. You listen for noise, but you hear nothing. Opening the door and scouting ahead of your party, you take 3 steps before you hear a loud, audible click. The door slams shut behind you, separating you from your companions, and a sinister-looking fiend appears before you. The room grows hot, and flames ignite at your feet. You've walked into a horribly gruesome trap. I'm Elephant Dice, and today we're going to talk about traps. Traps are something that most D&D players have a pretty solid grasp on. You can think of tons of movies and dozens of scenes that use traps for dramatic effect. Like the classic Indiana Jones scene with the boulder. Like, whoa! Or maybe you've seen Home Alone. Heads up! Now that's gonna leave a mark. These examples of traps are memorable and exciting, and tons of people love these movies and these scenes for a reason. Similarly, traps in your Dungeons & Dragons game can make for truly memorable and awesome encounters for your party. So let's get into the real meat and potatoes behind traps. In general, I think that there's probably only 2 main types of traps. The simplest traps are the ones that are really just one and done events. And oftentimes, the sole purpose of these traps seems to be just for dealing some damage. You roll a save once, and you take damage once. For example, you enter a room, and in the center, there's this large marble pillar with strange runes carved into its side. As you approach, and as you attempt to decipher them, the runes begin to glow, and all of a sudden, bam!
It's a trap!
That's right, Admiral, it's a trap. Explosive runes are just one example of a trap that happens only one time, and once they happen, they're used up. But when we think of scenes like Indiana Jones, that's a whole series of traps. And I think a lot of the times, the way that these one-and-done traps are used most effectively is when you have a whole chain reaction of traps again and again and again. Obviously, when you use multiple traps together, this can be extremely exciting, but also extremely lethal. These traps, whether or not they're independent or in a sequence, they kind of explain themselves because for the most part, their purpose is just kind of to deal damage and to pose a lethal threat to your players. But traps aren't really just one and done events, and there's actually a whole second type of traps which have a more active role ingrained into them. In general, if you have a trap that's just one and done, it's a lot less effective than a trap that can be constantly recycled and constantly used against people who you're trying to keep away. From a defender point of view, you actually get a lot more mileage out of a trap that you can reuse again and again. Take, for example, a pit trap. There's a difference intrinsically between an arrow shooting out of a doorway when you open the door and when you've triggered a pit trap. And the main difference is that when you trigger a pit trap, you have more challenge than just the damage of the trap outright. You now have the hazard of there's a large chasm that you now have to cross. Environmental hazards are things that real life traps and really like historically siege warfare is all about taking advantage of. So a pit trap is really a perfect example of a simple environmental trap, but it also isn't a trap that actively we're maintaining. And I think this segues into what I think is really the second type of trap that you can employ. And those are traps that are actively being maintained, used, and adapted. Think of Home Alone. They reuse traps in the Home Alone movies. And the cool thing is as the dungeon master, having traps throughout a dungeon or a lair that you have your creatures or your enemies or whatever you call them, monsters, having traps that monsters can man and adapt to as the players traverse through your dungeon can set up for some really cool creativity and just general fun. You can literally run an entire dungeon that is just filled with guards who are manning traps and triggering them as they run into the party members. Have you ever heard of Tucker's Kobolds? Back in the day of Dungeon Magazine, before I was even born, it was an article that was written which basically had to do with a high-level party that they were killing it. They were doing great. They weren't being challenged by normal, tougher enemies. So, according to the article, the dungeon master, who I think his name was Tucker, he sent them into the lair of kobolds. And being higher level adventurers, they probably scoffed at the fact that, oh, kobolds, they can't challenge us. Boy, were they wrong. Kobolds, in general, are a race that is known for setting up traps, having like math and all this like engineering kind of ingrained into them. So when Tucker, or whatever this DM's name was, when he brought his players through the dungeon, the entire dungeon was set up so that it was completely beneficial for kobolds. It was built for small characters. It had small, tight passages which medium-sized characters struggled to pass through. And every time they went into a new room, there was a new hazard. Murder holes, from which kobold archers could shoot at the players from behind heavy cover. Strange rooms which were covered with slick black oil, and then all of a sudden, kobolds would throw just a torch onto the oil, igniting the players. Vials of acid just being chucked. Ladders which were purposely designed to break under the weight of larger characters. These types of challenges really aren't that hard to come up with. But not every DM really has the time or the attention span to design some crazy death trap dungeon. If I may be frank, and I'm Joseph, it's also generally not the best idea to plan everything out. Your players are just going to steamroll everything, do something you never expected, and then you're going to be sitting there saying, wow, I planned all this stuff that never happened. I wasted my time. If you'd like to have a video on how I design dungeons, comment down below. But, a challenging Tucker's Kobolds-esque trap is actually a lot easier than you think. And the reason why is because a lot of creatures in Dungeons & Dragons have hints as to what kind of environments they have strict advantages in. Here are some examples I've used in my own campaign. My players went underground and entered into a drow lair. And as they were inside the lair of the drow and fighting these basically drow archers at the end of the hallway who would run away, there were these strange pressure plates that released a sleeping gas. Literally just the spell sleep. Drow and elves, for that matter, are immune to magical sleeping effects. So this was really just a simple environmental hazard that really I leveraged as a trap in my dungeon that the creatures in my dungeon, the drow, were using to their advantage. At any point, if you're on the home turf of a monster, you should be scared because any intelligent creature is going to booby trap or prepare their lair for some advantage that they can have. In the recent one-shot I spoke about in my White Dragon video, if you haven't already, you should definitely watch my White Dragon video. In that one-shot, my party was exploring an ancient burial site in which this race of indigenous warriors worshipped fire spirits in order to stay warm. But there was something else that was actually happening behind the scenes. Really, the indigenous warriors that had gone extinct in that burial site had died out for a completely other reason. They delved too greedily and too deep. In an attempt to completely stop the snow altogether, they summoned a devil, a bone devil, also known as an ocelith. So when my players walked into this strange crypt-like room, they saw a statue hanging inverted from the ceiling, and they broke the statue and they found a strange corpse that was just hanging upside down with an artifact in its mouth. As they removed the artifact, the hallway that was behind them went up in flames, and the bone devil appeared before them. And my bone devil reached towards the players, attempted to grapple, and drag them into the flames, literally a wall of fire, to cast them into the flames. My group had a paladin, and they actually ended up knocking the bone devil prone, so he died pretty quick. But the point is this was a completely different encounter that completely used a trap to a creature's advantage, because bone devils are immune to fire damage. This is just a simple thing that you can do in your campaign. Leveraging traps as environmental hazards can help to make your scene that you're portraying to your players feel more tense and immersive. And it definitely felt that way. I forgot to add, there was also a flame elemental that was summoned at the same time. My players were actually fighting two things that were walking through the flames, and one of them was trying to drag it into the flames. It was just a nasty encounter. But it was more than just a simple trap. The players were stuck in the room until the flames were put out, which happened immediately because one of my players had a wizard who was a complete Chad. But until those flames were put out, I was fully expecting to probably TPK my party right there. The Bone Devil and the Fire Elemental were pretty challenging without the environmental hazard that was posed by this wall of fire that sprung up as a trap in the middle of combat. But, at the end of the day, I think leveraging that trap really portrayed to my players just the level of danger and the threat that the Bone Devil actually posed. They took the creature extremely seriously because it was literally trying to drag them to hell. Kinda. Enemies that are smart will use the terrain and environments to their advantage. And at the end of the day, traps are really just part of your environment. If you think of those scenes like in Indiana Jones or in Home Alone, really it's just a hallway in Indiana Jones that he's running down with all these traps in the boulder, but it's an environment. And making an environment memorable involves making it challenging. And to me, leveraging your environment is a way to make an encounter not only challenging, but memorable. At the end of the day, you can also just make up anything you want. Like, there's no problem with giving a creature a ring of fire protection, or just giving it immunity to fire, or acid, or whatever hazard you want to have. An ethereal creature that arrows pass right through, wow, it's not that hard to come up with. Gary Gygax once said that the secret that we should never let game masters know is that they don't need any rules. And really, you don't need rules either. You can look at a monster stat block, you can take the clues of, maybe they would be good at leveraging this trap or whatever. But because it's high fantasy, you can literally say whatever you want, and your players pretty much have to accept it. Whether or not they're rules lawyers or they really believe it's possible, magic makes it possible. So feel free to magically supplement anything you want in your game and to leverage traps however you want to. Just remember that at the end of the day, traps don't have to be these one and done instances. A lot of traps have always been, historically, environmental hazards. And environmental hazards and leveraging them to the benefit of your creatures is a great way to make your players take your creatures and your monsters seriously. The more seriously your players take your game and what you throw at them, the more immersed they will become in your game. And at the end of the day, that typically translates to more fun, at least in my opinion. It's a trap. 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 Speaking of traps, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you like my content, more content coming soon. And yeah.